Hey, welcome to today's full moon broadcast. I'm Janelle Inerarity, the founder of the Eco-Spiritual Education Center, and I'm excited to be with you today on the Why Nightmares Are the Best Dreams full moon broadcast. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a subject that's really juicy and interesting to me and that I work with clients on a lot, which is the subject of not just dreams, which I work with a lot, but nightmares in particular. So I'll give you a little bit of background about who I am and what I do, and then I'll talk to you just in general about nightmares and some definitions and misconceptions that come up in that territory, and then we'll work with how to work with them. Why are they the best dreams? Why am I saying that? And how can you work with them to really make them powerful for yourself, to make them useful for yourself? Because it's an experience that most of us have had at some point. So like I said, my name is Janelle Inerarity. I founded the Eco-Spiritual Education Center, and the focus there is personal healing with global impact. So taking your personal work, your inner work, and connecting it to the world, whether that's through a social service or just through the way that you interact with the world, and at the same time taking what's happening in the world and making it relevant for yourself. So the two pieces of work are interconnected. You can't really separate them and just do your own inner work or just work on the world. There has to be a bridge. And so that's what I do with people on a daily basis, and a lot of what I write about. So I am a process-oriented facilitator. I studied at the Process Work Institute in Portland, Oregon, and I work privately with clients as a coach and a mentor, and then also work with people in a counseling capacity in a licensed clinical setting. I work with groups and organizations as well, and I'm also a licensed massage therapist specializing in abdominal massage, so working with the core of the body, specifically with the Arvigo technique of Maya abdominal therapy and with Qinate Song, which is an ancient Chinese abdominal therapy practice. My background is in sustainable food systems, environmental studies, specifically food systems, working with permaculture and gardening and community gardens and sustainable agriculture, and also with backcountry and wilderness-based skills. And so every full moon I do a broadcast like this, and like I said, my background's environmental studies, so it's really important to me to connect what I'm doing to this earth-based and land-based experience. So on this full moon, when the light is brighter, when the pull of gravity is stronger, going outwards, doing this broadcast, connecting in this live and interactive way. And on the new moon, I send out my newsletter, and you can go to my website, ecospiritualeducation.com, and you can sign up for the newsletter. And so when we're in the darkness, when we're in the time of going inside, when we are reflecting and introverting, that's when the newsletter comes out, and the space is there for you to just receive that information and take it in and explore. So I mentioned process work, and just to give you a little framework, a little background there, very simply, process work is an awareness method which follows patterns and signals of an individual's or a group's process, or their way, their trajectory, their tendencies, which helps the individual or the group become more self-aware and more whole. And whole refers to the idea that we have many fragmented parts of our awareness which aren't integrated into our conscious experience. So those things end up acting on us or affecting us in ways that we're not conscious of how we're interacting with them. And when we harness the power of those, when we become conscious of those things, then we're not as subjected to the effects, but we can be in relationship with them. We can have a two-way dialogue between ourselves and our world, or between ourselves and internalized parts of ourselves that we're less aware of. So nightmares are a perfect example of this process of integrating fragmented parts and picking up the power of those fragmented parts. So I chose to share today on this topic because nightmares are both very common and they're also very misunderstood. Right? So most of us have the experience of having had a nightmare, whether you had some as children, they're much more common in children, whether you have them periodically now as an adult, whether you have had more nightmares during times of transition or stress, that's a very common experience. But in westernized and industrialized societies, we tend to have this notion, this cultural myth, if you will, that dreams in general are meaningless, and nightmares in particular are meaningless. It's fluff, it's dreamland. It's not something that we consider to be real, right? And if you have a nightmare, maybe as a kid, your parents might say to you, oh, it's just a dream. It's just a dream. Just let it go, right? You might say that to yourself now, or your partner or your friends might say that to you now, like, oh, it's just a dream. Just let it go. Just shake it off. Go back to sleep. And dreams are nonlinear. We can't touch them. They don't always make sense to us. And so it becomes easy in a very logic-based society to dismiss them. And the reality is that they have their own logic and they have their own message, and it's a powerful message, and it's different for each individual. So I'm going to talk to you a bit today about how to unfold and discover what that message is for you with your own dreams. I would also like to presence the idea that the dreams are very real, right? So we say, oh, it's not real because I can't touch it or I can't feel it, but the dreams are very real. The feelings that happen in them are real. The stories are real parts of our lives that are in our psyches that are coming in to give us some information. Oftentimes they're pointing to real physical experiences. So there are whole fascinating bits of research on illnesses and dreams, and how certain dreams or sometimes nightmares will come in, and a person will have dreams around an illness, sometimes even before they're consciously aware, or before mainstream medicine has figured out what is happening. The dream is sending signals about what's going on there. They also point to real social issues, real relationship issues, real world issues, and sometimes they're even used to solve real problems. So, Einstein was really famous for catching ideas for his math problems in dreams, working on these big equations, and then would have dreams or dream-like experiences that brought him that insight. So they're real in that sense, even though you can't touch them, even though you can't go out and interact with them in your everyday life. I'm actually going to teach you some ways that you can start to do that in a different way. So first, let's talk about the definition of a nightmare. So a nightmare in psychology is a dream that is so scary and disturbing, or that is scary and disturbing, and that wakes us up. I love that part of the definition. I find that really fascinating, right? So this dream wakes us up. You can have a bad dream, you can have an unpleasant dream, but for it to be technically called a nightmare, obviously something can be nightmarish regardless of technical definition, right? But to technically have a nightmare, it has to be something that's scary, disturbing, unpleasant, and that wakes you up. And so literally nightmares are here to wake us up. And from a process-oriented standpoint, they tend to wake us up at the most disturbing point, right? At the place where we are the least integrated in our awareness. The thing that's the most edgy, the most unknown, the most disturbing, the strangest, the most frightening, tends to be the point where we are jarred into wakefulness through this nightmare. And it's like, another way of saying that is the dream is saying to you, hey, pay attention to this part, right? Notice this part of the dream. The dream is saying that to you. It wants you to remember that heart. So it wakes you up. That's the cliffhanger, so to speak. So if you're thinking about increasing your wholeness, increasing the wholeness of your experience, and being alerted to the less conscious parts of your awareness, that still doesn't quite tell us why nightmares are the best dreams, but I think that they're showing us not only the things which are at the edge of our consciousness, but also the things that are so far from our primary identities that they are other or they are terrifying. And often this is our most powerful material. So I'm saying to you today, nightmares might be your best dreams because they're also pointing to your deepest power or your deepest powers that are the least known to you or the least integrated in your experience, in your ability to pick up that power in your everyday life. And you can see this in nightmares when you see that they are often full of very powerful characters, right? Monsters show up in nightmares. Villains or supervillains show up in nightmares. Sometimes the characters who we perceived to be the most powerful when we were children show up in nightmares, or big political figures show up in nightmares. But they're places where even death shows up in nightmares, right? Death is this ultimate power. And when we can pick up those power energies, those characters, those bits that are pushed away and said, that's other, that's not part of who I am, when we can pick up little bits of those energies, then we are empowered with those capacities in our lives. So before we work with or on these nightmare processes, I want to say a little bit about extreme situations where nightmares can tend to be present. One of those is post-traumatic stress, often referred to as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And I like to stay away from the disorder aspect of it because I and a lot of other people working in the field of psychology believe that the disorder aspect is really not, hey little birdie, it is not a functional way of thinking about PTSD because it's post-traumatic stress, but it's not a disordered response. It's a really ordered response. It's a really healthy way of responding to a very unhealthy situation. So when someone has experienced post-traumatic stress, has experienced a traumatic event, nightmares will sometimes cycle, right? And that is partly because the event itself is unresolved, or the experience, the threat, the fear is unresolved. Something happened that didn't get a resolution that ended in a sense of safety or a sense of being whole again. And so the dreams will tend to reflect that, right? So, and Leo Birdie just joined. I want to say we're talking about the experience in post-traumatic stress where nightmares are very extreme, which is not the main focus of this talk today, but just that they're cycling. And so in post-traumatic stress, the nightmares will often tend to be about the event or something related to the event, and it'll be the same thing again and again, right? So the psyche is really working on this same thing again and again and again without a resolution. And actually, I was at the International Association for the Study of Dreams conference. I presented there in 2018, and one of the other presenters, whose name I'm going to have to look up and enter this later, so check later because I'll write that down in the comments below because I can't remember their name right now and I have to search through some bins for my notes. But I want to just share that this wasn't an original idea, but the idea that this presenter was sharing was that post-traumatic stress may in some ways be a certain kind of sleep disorder, a dream disorder, in the sense that in our quote-unquote normal dreaming process, we are resolving things. We're taking bits of information, integrating them in new ways, and coming up with a new experience or a new way of relating to something. Whereas with post-traumatic stress, the same thing keeps happening again and again. And so the work then becomes about finding resolution, about dreaming on, if you will, is a process work term where we sort of like dream into the next phase of something. What happens next? How do we integrate this information? So I wanted to presence that before we start to do practices and exercises here, because that's a much more complex process, and it's a bit of a different process than just your typical experience with nightmares that most people are having. And so also, if you start to work on them yourself, if you have a post-traumatic experience, it can amplify, it can increase your dreams or your experiences or your emotions. And I want to encourage people to get support, get the support of a trained professional who knows how to work with those types of dreams, those types of emotions. And that being said, this is really useful material to integrate in that setting. So other places where you could have an extreme dream experience that's a little bit outside of the spectrum of, quote unquote, the norm, because I don't know if I really believe in normal so much, but things like medications, things like particular sleep disorders, things like withdrawals or addictions can really amplify the experience of nightmares. They can cause very extreme nightmares, chronic nightmares, nightmares that are hard to wake up from. And that's not really the focus that we're working with today, although this material can be one useful aspect of working with that much bigger picture, which needs a bit more larger scale support. So all this theory is really well and good, and we have a bit of context for what's kind of a typical nightmare experience. Like little kids have lots of nightmares. Most people have them, during times of stress or transition. And then if you have an extreme experience of nightmares, it's good to get some extra support. But okay, we have all this theory. What good does it do you if you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're in a cold sweat and you're terrified and you just like saw this monster, you just felt like your life was threatened in your sleep? Or sometimes it's something really unusual. Sometimes when you unfold a nightmare, it's not like this big scary thing. It's actually strange or funny, or you wake up and you say, why was I scared of that, weird little everyday thing that in my dream was so terrifying? So this material is really helpful for working with that. So a few tips for working with your own nightmares, your own nightmare-like experiences in even daydreams. So this works for nighttime dreams and daydreams. And the first one is to work with the feeling atmosphere of the room. So when you wake up, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but lots of people have this experience. I have this experience. Maybe you have a different way of working with your nightmares when they show up. But when I wake up from a nightmare, often there's a feeling atmosphere in the room. So it's this palpable thing. I can sense the emotional atmosphere that was present in the dream, especially at that moment of waking up. And sometimes it even takes a minute to orient myself to, okay, where am I? Oh, there's the wall, there's my bookshelf, oh, here's my sheets. Like really noticing, hey, I'm back in my everyday reality. But the feeling atmosphere is really important. So I want to encourage you at that moment, and even as you're remembering right now, if you're thinking about a nightmare that you've had in the past, even like I'll talk to you today, I did some work in preparing for this webinar, this broadcast today, and I worked with dreams I had 20 years ago and found new information. So feel free to work with any nightmare that you've had in the past that comes up and you find interesting, or that still has some sort of charge that was memorable. So in that moment, when you woke up, what was the feeling atmosphere? And I want to invite you to get really curious, almost like a scientist. I want you to get in there and think, was my heart racing? Did I have a certain sensation on my skin? Did I have goosebumps? Was my skin clammy? Did I feel hot? Had I twisted the sheets all up? Was I moving a lot? Did I wake up because I moved a lot, or was I frozen? One of those dreams where I was trying to scream or trying to move or trying to fight, and my body was frozen and I woke up from there. What is that feeling atmosphere? Is there a residual feeling of a dream-like pain Did you have shortness of breath? Uh, just observe these sensations and get really, really specific. Hey, Andrea, good to see you. We're talking about the specific techniques to work with the nightmares and feeling into the atmosphere of the room. So in that moment when you wake up, not just noticing the body sensations or noticing things like twisted up sheets, but also noticing the precise emotion that's happening. So not just, oh, I was afraid. It's good to notice that, but were you afraid in an anxiety kind of way? Were you afraid in a terror kind of way? Were you afraid in a suspenseful way, or was there shock? Was it sudden, or did you feel trapped? Was it like entrapment, and that's the type of fear or the type of emotion you were experiencing? So all of those things are really relevant to the message of the dream, the content of the dream. And like I said, you can work with a dream you had 20, 30, 40 years ago. It doesn't matter. If the feeling's still there, if the information's still there, it can still be relevant to your life. So first thing there, noticing all the really detailed elements of the actual experience, the feeling environment and the emotional environment of that dream. And that becomes really important as you are thinking about how it relates to your life, which we'll talk about at the end of this segment of the conversation. So sticking with this scientist kind of way of working with dreams, now start to get really detailed about the characters and the place. So in your dream, are there human characters? Are they characters you know or characters you don't know? Are they celebrities, people from history? Are they mixed characters? So sometimes we have these dreams where, you know, it's sort of my friend, but it's also sort of an actress that I find really interesting, or it's like sort of my friend, but they have some different qualities than they normally have. Like sometimes we get these like blended characters in our dreams. So start to notice who's there. Are there animals there? Are there creatures, plants? And then what is the location of the dream? And this gets left out a lot. So, you know, we might have a dream and say, oh, my friend was there and they said this and they did this, but we don't examine so much culturally speaking. In process work, we do this a lot, but just in general mainstream conversation about dreams, we don't talk about where we were. So I had a dream, for example, that was a nightmare many, many years ago, where the action was really hot. Like it was really intense. There was, you know, a big explosion, a big transition. But in the dream, also the location of the dream was this wide, dark lake. And it was still, and it was nighttime. There was no action. There were no boats. There were no planes. There were no birds. There was no wind. It was just a wide, dark lake. So when you're exploring your dreams, exploring your nightmares, it's interesting to notice where you are. That atmosphere or that location is equally as important and has just as much information for you as the big action points. So those big action points, right, the explosive aspect of the dream that I'm thinking of here, that was a realization, an important aspect to work with, but then also the dream was telling me some way to balance that, or some other skill or capacity that I have within myself that was less in my awareness, was this big, still, dark depth. So notice in your dream where you are. And feel free, as I'm talking, by the way, to enter questions if something comes up and you want me to pause. Just pop a question in there and I'll answer it as I go. So from the dream that I was just describing, there's a juxtaposition, right? There's two kind of extremes. There's a explosive aspect and there's a wide, still aspect. So start to notice those juxtapositions where there are intense or extreme opposites present in your nightmare. Notice the specifics of the people who are there. So not just, my friend George is there. Is George a tall person? Is George a short person? Is George a very skinny person, a very fat person? Does George have a particular ethnicity? Does George have a particular haircut? All of these little nuances become really important in the dream, especially as dreams will tend to change things from our everyday experience, right? It'll be somebody with maybe a little bit of a different tendency than in our waking lives. And don't assign meaning to these things yet. And that's really important. So in this, we're like in an information gathering phase. And so, you know, I said, pretend like you're a scientist, right? And as a scientist, you're not going to go into an experiment with the idea that you already know the answer to it, or that you already know what's going to happen. You might have a hypothesis, you might have an idea, but if you go in looking only for that idea, you're not going to see what's actually there. So when you're working on your dream, go in like that scientist and work with what's actually there. And it helps to write this down. This person was tall. They were standing to my right, and we were in the desert, and there was one tall cactus, but we didn't see any other plants, which was strange because usually there would be scrub plants on the ground. All kinds of little details like that are really, really helpful for exploring the content of the dream. And also notice very shadowy figures that might be there. So for example, I had the sense that there was a woman in my dream, but she was just kind of over here, and she didn't have specific characteristics. I don't know who she was or what she was about or even what her name was. I just know that there was a woman over here. So that kind of stuff becomes really important to just jot down, just notice as well. Gather all of that content, okay? And so once you've gathered the content, you've gotten in touch with the emotional experience and the atmospheric experience of the dream, now start to zero in on the thing that was the most disturbing, the strangest, the scariest, the weirdest, the part that woke you up and startled you into your waking environment, and be really specific about that point. So for example, I had a dream once years ago where it was a memorable nightmare. I can get immediately in touch with the nightmarish aspect of this dream. And the scary part of the dream was I was laying on the beach in the surf. So in the shallow part of the surf where I could lay down and the waves were just kind of rolling over. And then in that shallow part of the surf, so already that's a strange thing, and you'll know why, a shark swam by and swam along my spine, and I woke up terrified, right? So it's a bit strange. There's a juxtaposition there, right? Because I'm in the shallow part of the surf, but there's a shark swimming there, really at a depth that a shark wouldn't be able to swim, but in my dream, that's possible. And it's also an edge zone, right? There's the beach and there's the water, and it's that place of meeting, and I'm right in that place of meeting. And also a shark is something that can go really deep into the ocean and exists at that place between life and death in a way, right? It's a powerful killer in the ocean. It's a very powerful creature. So those are some of my associations without assigning meaning about my life at the time, just noticing edge zone, water, shark. And the important thing for the moment of fear is not just, it's a shark. It's really easy to say that, to say, oh, there was a monster, oh, there was a killer, oh, there was my mother, like whatever it is that you're afraid of, right? Whatever in your life is challenging. My mom, hi, I love you. If you're watching, you're awesome. You've not been my nightmare. So there's a tendency to dismiss something based on the way that we identify it without actually exploring what's scary in it. So in this dream, if I drop into that experience of the shark, the placement is really important. So I'm lying in the surf, and the shark swims along my back. And so I can't see it. And as I worked on this dream, I realized the really scary thing in this dream is that I don't see the shark, but I feel it. And it's that sensation, the shark right along my spine, not like brush my arm, not like brush my leg, right along my spine. And it's that feeling of the shark's skin. So, if you're familiar with sharks, they have this like serrated, scaly skin, and it's sharp as knives. I mean, there are cultures that use the skin of a shark like a sandpaper. It's very sharp. And so that's going along my spine and I can't see it. So when I get in touch with the actual feeling of that, that's the disturbing element, not just that it's a shark, the feeling. And when I get in touch with that feeling, what I experience in myself is this deep instinct, right? This really deep alertness and the kind of animalistic instinct, that reptile brain, that part of myself that is not thinking, not nice, not feeling, not smiling, just I'm feeling what's going on and I am responding to the world from a attention-based, survival-based place, not in panic, but just like a snake or like a shark, right? That's how they're just very, very, very present with what's happening in the moment in an instinctual way. And so there's the content of what was actually scary in the dream, and what is disturbing to me fundamentally there is being in that place of instinct. So that becomes really interesting, right? Because it's not actually then a fear, oh, I'm going to get eaten by a shark. I was living near a beach at that time. I did, go swimming. I was cautious, but that's not the real fear that's happening there. It's that fear of being in touch, contact, sensation with that kind of instinct. So